the College of Education and the Center of Excellence for Teaching and Learning Colloquium Series. I'm Doreen Camerata-Gihuli, class of 1989, and the Associate Director of Alumni Relations. To provide a little background, this series, which features dynamic educators and administrators making an impact in their respective fields, is intended to establish online forums that engage in thought-provoking and critical dialogue with our alumni faculty, community leaders, and elected officials. The College of Education and the Center of Excellence for Teaching and Learning endeavors to empower leaders, educators, and parents to address the challenging times while advocating for the principles of social justice in our educational system and within our society as a whole. Before we begin, I would want to go over a few guidelines. In order to avoid any potential audio or video issues or interruptions during the program, all participants have been muted upon entry, and we ask you to remain muted throughout the conversation, both audio and video. We will now give everyone a moment to ensure that both audio and video are turned off before we proceed. Thank you. Secondly, if you're viewing from your personal computer or laptop, in order to optimize your viewing experience of the program, we recommend you change your view to active view as opposed to gallery view, as this will highlight the individual who is speaking at the time. This should be located at the upper right-hand corner of your screen. Click Speaker View, then select Active Speaker View. If you're viewing from a phone or a tablet, your default view should be set to Active Speaker View. At last, in order to ask questions, we asked you to use the chat feature to communicate, which will be monitored throughout the program, and questions shared will be with the panelists and monitored throughout. Without further ado, I would like to introduce to you the Dean of College of Education, Dr. Stephen Hegedus.
Thank you, Doreen. Good evening, everybody. The College of Education at Southern Connecticut State University welcomes you this evening to the start of our 2022 colloquium series, hosted by the newly established Center of Excellence for Teaching and Learning. Thank you for joining us virtually this evening for our first in a series of important and timely talks this year on mental health as it relates to teaching and learning. This series is designed for our alumni and our students who are working in schools and studying in college. We also welcome faculty, superintendents, and leaders in schools, as well as state and elected officials. As in all our colloquia, we aim to bring you speakers that are focused on relevant themes in education today. Sometimes challenging and difficult topics, often with multiple perspectives and positions, but always in an open and respectful academic environment. Thank you for attending tonight and for your continued support. It now gives me great pleasure to introduce Dr. Kari Sassu, Founding Director of the Center for Teaching and Learning, who will welcome our speaker and moderate the session tonight. Thank you, Dr. Sassu.
Thank you, Dean Hegedus, for that intro, and thank you for supporting the CTL and this series tonight. I am honored to be serving as the first director of our Center of Excellence for Teaching and Learning, and delighted to see so many people here tonight. Well, see your screens at least. This is the first colloquium in the series, as Dean Hegedus highlighted in the series, addressing mental health as it relates to teaching and learning. And tonight I have the great pleasure of introducing Dr. Shannon Suldo, who will be talking about positive emotions and relationships as the bridge to engagement. So just want to tell you a little bit about Dr. Suldo before I hand it over to her. Dr. Suldo is a professor in the school psychology program at the University of South Florida. She received her PhD in school psychology from the University of South Carolina in 2004. She's a licensed psychologist in the state of Florida and continues to provide school-based mental health services to youth in the Tampa area. She has extensive research and clinical experiences in school-based mental health services, including establishing empirical links between student mental health and academic success, conceptualizing and measuring student mental health in a dual factor model that considers psychopathology and well-being, evidence-based positive psychology interventions for promoting positive indicators of student well-being, school-wide strategies to identify youth with mental health problems, and supporting teachers' emotional well-being. She is the principal investigator of a large federal grant to evaluate a selective positive psychology intervention to increase middle school students' subjective well-being. She's published more than 75 studies that convey findings from her research on how to access and promote complete mental health. And she is the author of Promoting Student Happiness, Positive Psychology Interventions in Schools, a 2016 book within the Guilford Practical Intervention in Schools series. I don't want to waste any more time having you listen to me because I know that Dr. Suldo has a lot to share with us tonight. I am delighted that she agreed to be here and excited for her to share her knowledge with us. Shannon.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Kari, and thank you more importantly for inviting me to speak with you all this evening. Okay, so I will go ahead and kick off this talk on positive emotions and relationships, which you'll hear me describe tonight as the bridge to student engagement. There will be several times throughout the presentation where I'll be pausing to answer questions. So as I walk you through an agenda I'll share in a minute, please feel free to type into the chat box any questions you have. And I thank in advance, Kari, for sifting through those and letting me know what questions we have at various points. So before I get moving, I want to acknowledge that the research I'm going to share tonight has been done over a 20-year period now in collaboration with several graduates of the University of South Florida School Psychology Research Group, School Psychology Program, and in particular members of our Positive Psychology Research Group. So I have listed some of the names of my students past and present. I also depend on the expertise of several colleagues at the University of South Florida and beyond to help me complete my studies. And I've been fortunate to have funding from the Institute of Education Sciences to do some of the work I'll talk about today. And the work that I am doing is all school-based in districts in the Tampa Bay area. So I'm very grateful for my local districts for taking part in some intervention development and refinement work, and to community agencies that also fund some of this work. So what I'll be talking about tonight is the role of wellness promotion in school-based mental health services for teachers and students. And I am a licensed psychologist, as was mentioned earlier. When I was trained in the late 90s to enter a career in school psychology, I learned a lot about how to identify and fix problems. And that was a pretty traditional approach, is what is causing individual suffering and what can we do to prevent and ameliorate those types of problems. In the early 2000s, I was fortunate to be part of the early stages of a different perspective referred to as positive psychology. And that represented a move from repairing the worst things in life to focusing on helping all individuals thrive and building the best things in life. And when positive psychology was first introduced in the year 2000 by Martin Seligman and Mike Csikszentmihalyi, they put out 3 pillars of positive psychology. And those pillars are listed here on your screen for you. The first pillar is, let's look more at positive feelings. So we know a lot about negative feelings of sadness and worry, but what about positive feelings about one's past, present, and future? And the interventions I'll describe today are intended to increase those positive feelings. Another pillar of positive psychology is, traditional psych has a lot to say about what's wrong with individuals and environments, but what are things that are right? What are the strengths of character that undergird positive actions in individuals that are cross-cultural, cross-societal, that we tend to value as moral virtues and strength of character? And tonight I'll talk about a resource you could go to that lists what positive psychology has advanced as a taxonomy of 24 character strengths. And then a third pillar of positive psychology sheds a light on not just strengths of individuals or good feelings, but what are settings that help individuals thrive. And in the study of positive institutions, that includes attention to positive features of families, as well as schools that create settings that are more likely to help students experience positive emotions and use their character strengths. More recently, positive psychology has advanced a theory called PERMA that advances that for all individuals to experience a flourishing mental health state, which is different than just not feeling bad or having health problems, but to experience a flourishing mental health state, there are potentially 5 different pathways to experiencing that. And those pathways are following the acronym PERMA. You can experience positive emotions, you can be engaged in your work or at school, you can experience positive relationships, get a sense of meaning in what you're doing during your day, or have a feeling of achievement and accomplishment. And different strokes for different folks, there are different pathways that lead to a flourishing mental health status, but what they have in common include identification and use of your character strengths. Another kind of background thing about positive psychology is that the primary outcome that many individuals, many researchers like myself have used to assess mental health is a term called subjective well-being. And subjective well-being is a term that was put out there in the 70s by Ed Diener. And he was at University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, and he said that if he was going to get tenured, he couldn't study happiness. It sounded too hokey. So he created this term, subjective well-being, and it really stuck. And when you see references to subjective well-being in Time magazine, newspaper articles, research articles, it really is a scientific operation of happiness. And it's comprised of 3 different dimensions. An individual who has high SWB, or happiness, if you will, overall says my life is going well, and on a daily basis experiences positive feelings like interest, pride, enthusiasm, joy, more often than they experience negative feelings like anger, despair, greed. And attention to individuals or classrooms or school levels of subjective well-being really underscores a positive psychology approach to mental health care. We are fortunate now to have reliable and valid measures of life satisfaction and affect that are accessible to youth easily ages 8 and up, and some additional measures on the horizon for younger children. And for you school psychologists in the audience, I have listed here some of the most common measures. They're all freely available in the public domain. Most common ones are things like the Student's Life Satisfaction Scale and the Positive and Negative Affect Scale for children. So now I'm going to turn to sharing a bit about what we know about subjective well-being in terms of, is it important to look at? Is it on the same continuum of happiness? So if you have a child or a student who is not experiencing anxiety, depression, conduct problems, does that mean that they are happy? Or is it a separate continuum that's related to but separable from emotional distress? So that is an empirical question. And to answer the question of, is happiness separate from mental health problems, my students and I started a series of studies in about 2008. The first one was published, and we surveyed samples of middle and high school students and had these students complete measures of life satisfaction and affect to determine their subjective well-being. And we also assessed their level of mental health problems. We gathered student self-report data on anxiety and depression, and teacher and informant ratings of the students' conduct problems. So traditionally in psychology, when we do school-wide screenings of mental health, it's usually quite problem focused. And we divide students into two groups. Either they have clinically elevated levels of emotional or behavioral problems, or they don't. And if they don't, we assume from the mental health standpoint, like they're fine, not in need of additional attention. But when we cross subjective well-being and mental health problems, we can get two additional groups of students. It's possible that there are students who don't have elevated emotional or behavioral problems, but when you ask them about their happiness, their life satisfaction, affect, we see that they're dissatisfied with their life or not experiencing many positive feelings. When that occurs in combination with low mental health problems, I would term that group vulnerable. It's possible also that there are students that have elevated emotional or behavioral problems, but when you ask them about their own personal sense of happiness, they say, life is going well. Maybe I'm bothering others, but not myself, or I might have elevated symptoms, but I manage it and it works for me. Those are students that I would call symptomatic but content. So in a traditional model of mental health, we only have two groups: people that have high mental health problems who we assume are unhappy, I would call those students troubled, and students that do not have mental health problems who we assume are happy, and I would call those students having a complete mental health profile. So our first work was simply to see, are there more than two groups of students? And the answer is yes. We've now done studies in elementary, middle school, many high school samples, and those studies have been replicated in different states, different countries, and a growing body of research has supported that all four groups of students indeed exist. There, at any given point in time in school-wide samples, fortunately, about 60% of students have a complete mental health profile: high happiness, low emotional and behavioral problems. That's what we want in our children. At the same time, about 15% of students are troubled. They need intense mental health supports because they have emotional and behavioral problems, and they have low happiness. But if we only looked at emotional behavioral problems, we would misclassify about a quarter of the students. And in particular, about 12.5% of students would be missed on school-wide screenings of emotional and behavioral problems, but picked up on measures of life satisfaction as reporting low happiness with life. And then about 12.5% of students are symptomatic but content. So the next question is, does this matter? If we see differences in outcomes between students that have the same level of emotional and behavioral problems, but different levels of subjective well-being or happiness, if you will, then it means that attending to happiness matters. So do we see differences in outcomes between students that don't have emotional and behavioral problems, but have high happiness or low happiness? And the answer is yes. When we compare those two groups of students, neither of whom meet symptom criteria for emotional or behavioral problems, we see that students who, in the absence of emotional and behavioral problems, but high happiness, that complete mental health profile, those students have better outcomes than their peers who would not be picked up on screeners of pathology, but have low levels of life satisfaction. And in particular, the best physical health outcomes, social adjustment, and identity development is seen among students who have the combination of low emotional and behavioral problems and high happiness. And where this gets really relevant to schools and educational leaders and school health providers is there's also some pretty significant educational outcomes that differ in accordance with students' happiness level. And in particular, students that have high happiness and low pathology, but that high happiness being critical, those students are more engaged in terms of indicators of cognitive engagement, feelings about school, and in-class behavior. And those engagement indicators translate to a year, 2 years later, our data shows us now, better academic skills when you look at the grades students earn in classes and their scores on high stakes tests. So happiness is highly relevant to students' academic outcomes. So in part because that data has amassed over a 15-year period, a definition of complete mental health that includes the traditional negative indicators of emotional behavioral problems, along with indicators of happiness and wellness, is increasingly being adopted by researchers and policymakers. And this definition of complete mental health prioritizes viewing students in terms of, do they have symptoms of problems, but also where are they on their own self-reports of life satisfaction and happiness. So on this row here, what you see are the primary categories of mental health symptoms or wellness indicators. And on the bottom, what you see are the factors that underlie traditionally what we know contributes to one's internalizing, externalizing problems or happiness. So what I'll talk about in the rest of my presentation really are ways that we can address students' subjective well-being and their life satisfaction, but I don't want to mislead folks with thinking like that's the best way to go in school. Instead, positive psychology programs and practices are part of a comprehensive approach to providing modern mental health services that, when you combine them with social emotional learning programs and practices, positive behavior supports, and trauma-informed care, you get a suite, if you will, of evidence-based programs and practices that address the different targets that underlie various facets of students' complete mental health. So I'm going to hone in on positive psychology practices, but really want to acknowledge that these practices I'll talk about go hand in hand with social emotional learning, PBIS, and trauma-informed care. And all of those different things are really necessary to address the risk factors for mental health problems and the promotive factors for well-being. So hopefully what you're hearing right now is that happiness matters, not just because it feels good in the moment. Like I have two children, one's a teenager, one's a 10-year-old. I would love for them to tell me that they feel happy. That feels good in the moment, but really more importantly, our data shows that it pans out in terms of their outcomes. The happier children and adolescents earn better grades, they do better on standardized tests, they are more cognitively and affectively engaged in learning, they're physically healthier, they have better social relationships, they experience less peer victimization, and they develop fewer symptoms of mental health problems. So maybe you're thinking right now, okay, well, can I increase happiness? Like if you were to ask me that as a parent, I would say my 13-year-old's pretty moody. I'm not sure I could help her. I try my hardest, but they bring certain things to the table. But what we know is that from this research on changing happiness, that there is a literature of evidence-based programs and practices that psychologists now have available to them that are evidence-based ways of improving happiness to the top part of one's set range, if you will. So when we first, collectively, the field of positive psychology first started thinking about what determines happiness, which then answers the question like, can you change it, or is it something that's fixed at birth? Sonia Lyubomirsky put out a theory that, happiness, the data we have available tend to suggest that about half of one's level of life satisfaction and typical affect ratio tends to be pretty genetically based, like for better or for worse. One's level of life satisfaction, their set range, tends to mirror that of their biological mother or father. And then the theory put out there that about 10% is attributable to life circumstances, whether you happen to live in Florida like myself, and this is the view you had on your walk to lunch today, or whether it's really cold and snowy, whether you live in a war-torn society or a peaceful location. So life circumstances are thought to attribute to about 10% of variability between people's kind of set point of life satisfaction. And then the glass half full, like the fortunately part, is that left a whole bunch, 40%, that we theorized was malleable, that you could learn programs and practices, ways of thinking, behaving, and striving and relating to others that would help increase your level of life satisfaction to the top point of your set range. Or if you don't do these things, it would help suppress it. So what do we know in 15 years of research? We know that Genetics likely account for about 40% of the variability, so at 50%, that's still a whole lot. We also know that those studies were done on mostly Western types of samples, and that there are individuals who live in settings that are so economically deprived or have other types of major stressors. So that 10% is probably larger for some groups of individuals. For instance, during a pandemic, those life circumstances are going to be much larger to manage. And we also know that it's not just having the tools to increase those intentional activities, but you have to be motivated to use them. And not all individuals are motivated. There are times when negative emotions serve a purpose. But there are, fortunately, that 40% is there's still this large chunk of variability between people that is able to be affected by how we relate and behave. So there's now a growing literature of what are ways to behave and relate that help increase your level of life satisfaction to the upper point on that biologically set range. And rather than go through a whole bunch of different practices, I'm going to summarize what they have in common. So what they have in common are these activities tend to evoke positive feelings deliberately about your past. So for instance, things like gratitude and forgiveness, about your present. So doing acts of kindness and using character strengths in new ways so that you're fully in a flow state, and about your future. So generating, for instance, hope and optimism. Those activities that evoke positive feelings like your past, present, or future are in line with what works to deliberately increase happiness in a lasting manner. Also, anything that counselors can do with the children and teachers that we serve to strengthen relationships between those individuals and ourselves as school mental health providers, or between students that are in groups together, or between educators, is going to work to increase happiness, because our research on very happy people shows that having rich and satisfying social relationships is necessary for high happiness. And then our third principle is it's not good enough just to have tools that evoke positive feelings and to prioritize relationships, but anything we can do to harness motivation to use those tools when it's right for you. So if you just experienced a traumatic event, or you lost your job, or you're in the middle of a breakup, like there's a time to feel those negative feelings and to accept them. And those negative feelings often have functions of getting you to change your situation, to behave differently. But when you want to feel in a better mood, hopefully you'll have these tools or understanding of priorities that help you, give you some control about evoking positive feelings when it's right for you. So why do positive feelings matter so much? Because they broaden and build our ability to think creatively, think flexibly, persist, be attractive to others socially, which in turn gives us even additional social resources, which increase happiness. So for more information on that, I encourage you to check out the work of Barbara Fredrickson, who has put out there that broaden and build theory of positive emotions that underlie a lot of what positive psychology programs and practices bring to the table. Sonia Lybromitsky also has put out a person activity fit model that, yes, we have these tools that evoke different positive feelings, but some folks like some better than others. So what we tend to do with our work with adolescents and teachers is introduce them to a whole bunch of different positive activities that individually lead to positive feelings, thoughts, behaviors, and need satisfaction, and then have them be emotional detectives and see which ones do they like the best, which ones work the best for them, and then help them plan how they'll use those activities at school and at home. So in sum, what we know is that there are ways of increasing individuals' happiness through activities that evoke positive feelings of the past, present, and future. And I've listed on here some of the activities that we use in our programs. And then also they go hand in hand with strengthening relationships in that school building in order to not just allow individuals to do things in isolation, but to create a rich setting that is safer for folks who feel like they can indulge in some of these positive ecology practices. So before I turn it over to Kari and ask for initial questions, I want to share with you some really promising research on when you take these programs and practices and put them into schools, what type of outcomes do you see? So this one slide I have here, two slides actually, sorry, Kari, got a few minutes, it is meant to convey a initial test in Israel of when you take these positive ecology programs and practices and put them into a whole school, what do you see? So in this initial test and over in Israel, where they're randomly assigned matched middle schools to a positive ecology approach to education or business as usual, they targeted 6 buckets, if you will, of positive ecology activities. They taught teachers ways of enhancing relationships in their classroom, evoking positive feelings, creating positive thoughts about the past and the future, and then using character strengths. So I mentioned earlier, I was going to tell you about character strengths. If you go to viacharacter.org, you can actually take an inventory and see what are your top character strengths. And in this intervention, they encouraged teachers who helped students spot strengths in themselves and in others. So this intervention involved teachers taking part in a series of 2-hour professional learning to learn these different strategies for creating better relationships and using positive emotions, using character strengths. So what they found in these randomized controlled trials to now is that in schools that were randomly assigned to have teachers get trained in positive ecology practices that I shared with you, and then they compared student outcomes for 2 years, that in a middle school setting, which tough bunch going through developmental changes. In middle schools, they saw that children who were in the positive ecology classrooms experienced increases in their happiness, reductions in their emotional problems, and improvements in peer relations. And by the time they got to 8th grade, they saw increases in students' engagement in the classroom and better grades. So we now have 2 randomized controlled trials of school-wide approaches to positive ecology interventions that really demonstrate that these practices that are taught in schools to teachers who then in turn do them in their classroom can lead to robust positive effects on student mental health, engagement, and course grades. So Kari, what questions do we have before I move forward to what we can do with teachers in particular?
Well, I am going to just reflect to you that I think you've drawn some really clear and direct lines between happiness, as you defined for us in your presentation, mental health, and what are traditional measures of success in schools, and also provided us those big ideas behind promoting happiness within schools. You just spoke about what's been done elsewhere outside of the US, and I'm wondering if you could potentially speak to, when we contemplate the place of positive psychology in our schools domestically, in our K-12 setting. Can you tell us a little bit more about what are some of the strategies that have been effectively employed in schools in the US?
Sure, great question. And before I move it there, I will acknowledge that a lot of the universal and class-wide work has been done, or at least in published studies, overseas. A lot of cool things come from Australia, mentioned the work in Israel, but the practices that are involved in these school-wide applications, a lot of them have stemmed from tests of American samples that began with Martin Seligman's work at University of Pennsylvania. I already mentioned Sonia Leibnitzky's work. She's in California, folks in Michigan, North Carolina, my own work in Florida. So the individual activities have been tested in isolation in US samples, but putting it all together has been a lot of overseas work where we've done school-wide applications. But I'm going to share with you a bit about our teacher work. And I'll share with you some work that we just actually did in the pandemic that I chose to, we're still in the pandemic, but in the active stages of the pandemic. And I chose to highlight that because people often ask me, is there a role of positive psych when things are going really bad? Okay, so when things are going well, yes, I want to feel better, but things are going really bad. Should I receive treatment for that or address the disease that we're experiencing? And I think if you, that's a good question. But what we have seen over and over again is that individuals in duress and in really terrible circumstance still want to feel good and deserve to feel good, as opposed to simply less bad. And they're different targets. So teachers, even before the pandemic, needed a lot of support, and all the educators on this call, I'm sure, can shout out the reasons why. But we have a lot of different newspaper articles talking about burnout and teacher stress, and the folks who are leaving the building, leaving the profession because of the stress of teaching. And then we're coming back in a pandemic. And as when schools closed down in late March of 2020, and some prepared to reopen in August of 2020, we wondered, like, what was that going to do to teachers in a profession that already is experiencing a lot of stress and a lot of burnout? And in Florida, my schools, when they reopened, my district that my children attend, we had the option in August 2020 of sending our kids remote, sending them in person or doing remote schooling. And in most of my district that I served, we had about 50% each way. So you had teachers like teaching both ways from the very beginning all year long. And it was like, are we surviving, or could we think about thriving? So what I'll share with you is some data on our work to address and ultimately hopefully improve teacher mental health during that very trying 2021 school year. And when we were approached by forward-thinking principals in the summer of like, hey, Shannon, you do research on happiness. I know mostly of it is for kids and parents. What do you have for teachers? Because I'm super worried about teachers coming back in this context. I was thinking, like, these principals I was working with were so forward thinking, because they know that teacher burnout and stress leads and negatively impacts teacher quality. And when it's difficult to teach in a classroom, you have kids who are less engaged, which then translates to worse educational outcomes. So getting ahead of this was really, really wise. So we met with our school leaders and said, well, what do you want to do? Do you want to reduce stress or increase well-being? And they said, we want people to feel good. What that looks like, we want to feel good. So we collectively agreed to take a positive psychology approach to not just figure out like everything that was wrong, which is important, but to give people, our teachers in particular, tools for building the best quality in life. And we defined teacher well-being from this dual factor approach that, well, first off, teachers are people, right? So we want you to do well at school, but we also want you to do well outside of school. So we created a model of teacher well-being that included their happiness at work, which is comprised of teacher efficacy and feeling connected, but also in terms of having mental health that had few symptoms of distress and perceived stress, and hopefully high levels of life satisfaction and flourishing. So we set out to impact all of these different indicators of teacher well-being. And when we look to see how we could do that, there's a literature of what works to improve teacher mental health, but they are isolated practices for the most part in American samples that are published at least. We could do activities that improve teachers' uses of character strengths. We could do mindfulness-based activities, walk them through gratitude interventions. But what we chose to do was adopt a multi-target intervention. So that's what I'll talk about now, is our pilot work with elementary school teachers using that PERMA model during the pandemic, the 2021 school year. So along with best practices in professional learning, we didn't just want to do like a one-day sit and get, here are some different tools you could do. Instead, we had a series of 5 3-week cycles in each cycle, we started off with a 1-hour didactic, introducing teachers to 2 different tools that were positive activities they could use in a deliberate attempt to increase positive emotions. In that 1-hour workshop, they learned a new tool. They received a 4-page wellness workbook that had notes on a refresher what the tool involved, So like 120 gratitude journaling, if you will. And then they had some time to plan how they would use it. They also did a self-assessment of their current level of well-being. So they filled out measures of all of these different aspects. And then after that first workshop, we sent them immediately after a workshop, their current level of well-being on all the indicators. They got 5 total score reports. They could track their own well-being over time and be their own emotion detectives and see, as they learned and did use these 2 new tools, how to impact their well-being from between workshop and workshop. And the workshops were spaced about 3 weeks apart. After our workshop, then we encouraged teachers to gather in their grade level teams and reflect on their personal use of the 2 positive activities. And then the next week, the teachers took part in individualized coaching sessions with a school mental health trainee. So what were the activities they learned in workshop 1? They developed tools for evoking their own positive feelings and building relationships. So the little yellow flaggies are the activities that we did from positive psychology. In workshop 2, they learned about character strengths and learned to spot strengths in others and use their strengths in new ways. In workshop 3, we targeted gratitude. So we did gratitude journaling and some health promoting behaviors. We added health to our PERMA model. In workshop 4, we worked with the teachers to acquire an acts of kindness strategy. We do 5 acts of kindness in one day, as well as a gratitude visit. And then we kind of put it all together in workshop 5, and teachers learned how to identify their core values, create an action plan that use their signature strengths and their other tools to strive towards those values, and then develop hope by visualizing their best possible self in the future. So it was a 15-week professional learning endeavor, 1 hour after school. The next week, 15 minutes in a staff meeting to reflect. And the week after that, 30-minute coaching sessions. So on a scale of 1 to 5, we asked teachers to rate if they, how much they liked these different components. And a score of 4 is typically a high level of acceptability. It's like, I agree with statements like, I'm confident I can use these activities. And our highest ratings were for virtual workshops. Our teachers also liked the wellness workbooks that were accompanying in the workshops. And the individual coaching was the hardest for them to engage in. Not many, I'd say about 20 of 70 teachers could carve out the time to take part in a 20-minute coaching session. More importantly, so first off, just establish that they at least really liked this content, especially what they learned didactically. And this is in 2020, 21. This was not easy time. So to carve out time to engage in your own well-being when there were so many other things to do was really critical. So we looked at their well-being assessments aggregated across the 70-ish teachers over time. And they were telling us after the workshops in a confidential manner, individually, what their current level of life satisfaction, stress, flourishing was. So we aggregated the data and looked to see over time, did life satisfaction change? This is about October. This is now February. This is all pre-vaccines being available widely in my state. Teachers were eligible about March. So it's not like the world was improving. Instead, during the pandemic, what we saw is that our teachers who learned ways of evoking positive feelings and relationships incurred significant increases in life satisfaction from an average of the slightly satisfied range to the satisfied range. So we saw meaningful growth in life satisfaction. We also saw over time significant declines in teacher stress. And remember, both of those things are important. Like you want to see improvements in wellness and declines in problems. And we saw reductions in perceived stress and increases in life satisfaction. We also saw increases in their goal attainment. So in workshop 1, we asked them to identify personally meaningful goals that we checked back in each week. And we saw that teachers were increasing in their attainment of goals. So in sum, we looked at a series of outcomes and found that educators' ratings of their well-being and their goal attainment pre-vaccine during a pandemic as they were teaching virtually and in person. The world was not a great place, but teachers who took part in this professional learning, sponsored and championed by their school administrators, indeed experienced reductions in stress, improvements in life satisfaction, while also making steady progress towards accomplishing their goals. And they liked the professional learning. They viewed it as worthwhile, which makes sense given they were seeing their own improvements. So you might be asking, like, hopefully you're thinking like, that's really cool. We have some tools to increase teacher happiness. But you might be thinking like, how did it translate to the well-being of their children in their classroom? So I'll say when I first started this project in this push in the summer, and they're like teachers, I was thinking, what about the kids? They said, let's deal with the teachers first. And it made a lot of sense. So then we weren't able to start measuring student mental health until about March. And our plan was in March, let's see the life satisfaction of the kids who were in the school. And then for kids needed help, we'll provide them some supplemental supports. So we did a school-wide screening of life satisfaction. And what we found was pretty surprising to me. What we found was that even in a pandemic, on a scale of 1 to 5, from 1 is terrible to 5 is delighted, 3/4 of the children who were in this school said that they were happy to delighted with life. Like, that's a really high number. I thought there'd be more kids at risk. We still had 1/4 of kids who were either like, or unhappy, but 3/4 of the kids in this school in a really difficult year had really positive levels of well-being. So we wondered, like, is that because we spent all that time at the beginning working with the teachers and supporting their own well-being and giving them tools they could use themselves? So we correlated the life satisfaction levels of children in the classes, okay, with the well-being of the teachers who taught their classes. And we looked at 2 different indicators of children's life satisfaction. We looked at their happiness with school in particular, and then their overall life satisfaction in all domains of life. What we found was that in March, kids' perceptions of if they thought school was terrible to delighted was predicted by the initial level of stress that their teacher reported. And we found that teachers who experienced higher levels of educator happiness at the end of the workshops had kids who were happier with school. So there were significant correlations between teachers' well-being and the children's school satisfaction. When you looked at children's general happiness, not just at school, but all areas of life, what we saw is that in March, the students that had the highest level of life satisfaction across domains were the kids who were being taught by teachers who experienced growth in their own emotional flourishing and growth educator happiness across the professional learning. So some really interesting data to show that, yes, we can improve teacher mental health by using positive psychology programs and practices. Yes, they find it valuable. Yes, it can translate into improvements in mental health, and those gains in turn translate to children's well-being.
So Shannon, I'm going to ask you another question, because you have just articulated those connections between teacher happiness and well-being and student happiness and well-being. And so I think logically the next question is, how do we promote teachers' happiness? And I'm sure a lot of people on this call tonight, this webinar tonight, are interested in learning that. How do we promote teacher happiness? And obviously we know why it matters, but.
Great question. So there are lots of different tools from the positive psychology literature that you can use. When I had that PERMA-H model up earlier, I mentioned things like addressing gratitude, character strengths use, visualization activities like me at my best and thinking my best possible self in the future, and then relationship enhancing activities. Where I'm going to go now are sharing some of the work that we do with teachers, and then with students, and then some of the tools are similar. So this is a book that I was asked by Guilford about 5 years ago to describe these activities in a book for practitioners, school health providers, school counselors, school leaders. And in this book, we talk about a program referred to as the Wellbeing Promotion Program that is in particular for students that have low levels of happiness. And we screen using a measure called the brief multidimensional life satisfaction measure, where we look at children's life satisfaction level. And for children that have room for growth, we do things with them like gratitude journals, gratitude visits, acts of kindness, character strengths use, savoring. And we provide it in a 10-week program that looks like this. There's also a parent component where parents can also learn some of these strategies. So I'm going to skip on to what we know about this work. What we know, when it's delivered into small groups of children in schools with usually a leader and a co-leader, two different mental health providers working in schools, what we know from the scripted intervention is that students tend to experience increases in life satisfaction, and those gains tend to maintain when there are booster sessions. So when school health providers follow up on a monthly basis with a reminder of the tools children learned. And let me back up a few slides. The book I mentioned earlier, Promoting Student Happiness, has scripted guides for school counselors to use to run this manualized program. It's like a sample 4-session session guide for one session. And then there's some activities that are built into it also. And when those activities ask students to visualize, for instance, their best possible self in the past or the future, they experience gains in well-being. And right now we're in the middle of a 5-year project to figure out the extent to which those gains in mental health translate to improvements in educational outcomes, student engagement, and grades. And what we saw even last year is that that program can be provided to kids virtually through Zoom. So we just presented at NASP about how to adapt a small group class-wide focus, small group modality to individual counseling over Zoom. And when we did this with 140 kids during the pandemic, after we were closed out of the schools, what we saw is that children experienced significant increases in global life satisfaction and average life satisfaction. And so did the 110 adolescents that we worked with and measured their life satisfaction with a different measure called the MSLSS. We also saw moderate effect sizes and significant growth. So we know, going the wrong way, here we go. We know that there are programs and practices that we can use to increase children's happiness in schools and virtually. And I have on here some quotes of what some parents and kids said. But I wanted to conclude with the fact that teaching children some of these activities works best when it's in a setting that helps a child feel supported and thrive. And that setting really starts with addressing teacher well-being. And on the next slide, I'll show you some resources for folks who want to start this like tomorrow, for instance. And it's really important that we increase subjective well-being because students that have this complete mental health profile of high happiness and few mental health problems have the best outcomes. They do the best academically, socially, physical health, identity development. And we can promote that complete mental health status through providing tools from Positive Psych alongside our work in social emotional learning and PBIS. And strengthening that setting by supporting teachers is really key. So the how-to, this is my final slide. I have some arrows for who these books are best kind of consumed by. But if you're looking at what I could do with children in my classroom or a small group level, that Promoting Student Happiness book has a manual for our wellbeing promotion program. If you're a school leader thinking like, this dual factor model of mental health, I have a lot of knowledge about how to reduce and prevent problems, but how do you increase well-being? Phil Lazarus, Bessel, and myself published a book last year as an edited book with lots of great folks contributing to it that talks about school-wide approaches to foster the emotional well-being of our youth by using that dual factor approach. If you're a parent and you're thinking like, what can I do at home to evoke positive emotions? The Strength Switch is a really great resource developed by Leah Waters in Australia. If you're any adult, my husband, the banker, has read this book. It's called The How of Happiness, and it's self-help tools, if you will, that are from positive psychology that are each by themselves evidence-based ways of increasing happiness. So your question, Kari, what do we do with teachers? I believe 90% of the activities that we took were right out of this How of Happiness book, which is published by Sonia Lyber-Miskey. It's an oldie but goodie, something about 15 years now. And then we supplemented it with work that's a little bit newer. But a lot of the tools are classics, are described in this book, and any adult can read it. And then if you're a teacher thinking, how do I strengthen that setting and relationship? My favorite book is Resilient Classrooms, also by that same Guilford series, that's meant to be like a highly readable, translatable, here's what we know from research, works in actual practice.
Excellent. So if you would, I'd like to read a couple of questions from the chat. I know we just have a couple of minutes left, but one of the questions was in asking for your opinion on whether positive psychology strategies are applicable across all ages in school, or if it has limitations with younger students.
Great question. I would say the most research is at the middle school level for whatever reason. My own students and I have applied our wellbeing promotion program to grades 3 through 5 also, and high school age, easily translatable to high school age. Third graders tend to get it, although we will admit learned optimism. And then when we have worked with kindergarten, first and second grade, we have kept many of the same targets. So we try to increase gratitude, identify use of signature character strengths, build hope, but we use a lot more popular media strategies. So we'll bring in books, we'll also bring in songs, a lot of developmentally appropriate teaching activities. And we have assessed students' life satisfaction throughout that process and seen students incur gains in life satisfaction in the more developmentally appropriate set. So yeah, so K through 12th grade in my research, and the work I mentioned from Israel earlier actually has been replicated in a preschool and first grade sample. So potentially some modifications in how kids do the activities, so that me at my best earlier, they might draw it as opposed to write it or speak it aloud. But the same types of principles of activities that deliberately make them experience positive feelings, whether past, present, or future, strengthen relationships, and then not feel like you have to do it all the time, but realize there's a time and a space for when you want to feel better, here's how to do it.
Excellent. Yes, having tools in your tool belt is always a good thing. Another question from the chat is, how can counselors in Connecticut get the training?
Good question. So folks can certainly email me and I'll put them in contact with people that are graduates of mine who I know now work in different states. I've also presented at NASP last week we've done virtual trainings with good outcome data. When I wrote this book at the request of Guilford, I meant it to be like a self-study, if you will, that the first 10 chapters are background and then the next 10, and then it's the manual. But what I've seen is people would like to have more supervised practice and doing mock role plays, the sessions, etc. So we've been doing virtual trainings for various school districts. Yeah.
Okay, so last question in the interest of time, because I do notice that it's 6:01. If folks want to leave here tonight and start exploring things tomorrow and venture into this work, what would you encourage them to explore first in order to start this in their schools?
Great question. So some resources I would go to that are web-based. So I put on here some books that I would say you could order on Amazon. But if you're looking at starting tomorrow, that viacharacter.org website I mentioned earlier, maybe I could pop it into the chat. So I'm going to pop a few things in. So viacharacter.org is a great resource on character strengths, a nice primer on that taxonomy of character strengths with lots of free visual aids of posters that are appropriate for various developmental levels, activities that can be done to target various character strengths. Love it. I also would visit Authentic Happiness. I think that one's a .org. I think so. But Authentic Happiness, I believe .org is the website maintained by Martin Seligman at the University of Pennsylvania. And there's a great wealth of information on that also. Berkeley maintains The Greater Good. It's a wonderful resource that has free information on positive psychology. So I think that's where I'd start.
Excellent, thank you. And you know, every time you mention Martin Seligman, it brings me back many years ago to being an undergrad in his lab. So I love the connections that are formed. I want to thank you very much for all that you've shared tonight. There was so much great information, and I found that your talk was inspiring. It certainly was a great way for us to begin this series, and I'm grateful that you were here. I thank everyone for attending tonight. I do want to announce that the next colloquium in this series will be at the end of March, on March 31st at 5 o'clock. Hopefully you will receive an email. And that one will explore mindfulness tools for teachers and learners, looking at the at neuroscience informed strategies for emotional resilience. So please look for that in your email. Thank you all for being here tonight, and most especially thank you, Shannon, for all that you provided.
It's my pleasure. I thank you for the time to speak about where positive psychology fits into the schools.
Excellent. Dean Hegedus, did you have any concluding remarks?
Just that thank you again so very much. And for those who are interested in follow-up work in Connecticut, maybe our new Center for Teaching and Learning can organize something and collaborate with you on virtually. That might be an opportunity. So we'll there's enough interest. Let's look into it.
Fantastic. Thank you. Thank you, Shannon. And thank you everyone for being here tonight. We hope to see you on March 31st. Good night.